They called him the quiet one, the serious one, the one who stayed in the shadows while his partner took the spotlight. But Rick Davis was never really quiet. His keyboards did the talking. When Rick Davis died recently after fighting cancer, the music world lost more than just another rock star. They lost the architect of a sound that defined an entire generation. The man whose blues-soaked piano made Supertramp more than just another British band. You know his songs even if you don't know his name. Bloody Well Right, Goodbye Stranger, Crime of the Century. While Roger Hodgson sang the pretty ballads, Rick Davis wrote the songs with teeth, the ones that bit back at the world. This is the story of a welder's son who became a rock star, but never forgot where he came from. A man who built musical partnerships the same way his father built ships, piece by piece, meant to last forever. But partnerships don't always last. And when Rick's fell apart, it created one of music's most bitter feuds, a war over songs and money and pride that lasted longer than most marriages. For decades, Rick Davis carried the Supertramp name like a burden, playing other people's Now He's Gone. And Roger Hodgson is still here, and that reunion everyone hoped for will never happen. Some broken things stay broken, but before the lawsuits and the bitterness, before the fame turned sour, there was just a kid from a railway town who heard something magical in an old record and decided to spend his life chasing that magic. Swindon wasn't a place where dreams came true. It was a place where trains got fixed and workers went home tired. Rick Davis was born into this world of grease and steel, where music was something that happened on the radio, not something you did. His mother Betty cut hair for a living. His father Dick sailed away for months, leaving behind a wife and son who learned to fend for themselves. Money was tight. Dreams were luxuries they could not afford. School was torture for Rick. He couldn't sit still, couldn't focus on books or numbers. Teachers wrote him off as a lost cause. His mother used to say Rick was hopeless at everything except music. That was the only thing that made sense to him. Then his parents brought home that gramophone, secondhand, like most things in the Davis house. The previous owner had left some records behind, classical stuff mostly, but there was one that changed everything. Gene Krupa's Drummin' Man hit 8-year-old Rick like a thunderbolt. This wasn't background music or something pretty to hum along with. This was power. This was emotion made sound. Rick played that record until the grooves wore smooth. A neighbor helped Rick build a drum kit from biscuit tins and cooking pots. The boy spent every free moment pounding out rhythms, trying to capture that feeling he'd heard on the Krupa record. His neighbors probably wanted to murder him, but his mother let him play. Soon Rick joined the railway workers' brass band. It wasn't rock and roll, but it was real music with real musicians. He learned discipline, timing, how to play with other people, skills that would serve him well later. Then rock and roll invaded Britain. Elvis, Chuck Berry, Little Richard music that was dangerous and alive in ways the brass band never was. Rick formed his first real band, Vince and the Vigilantes. The name was bigger than their talent, but they had passion. Rick switched from drums to piano because he needed to write songs, not just keep time. He taught himself to play by listening to records, by trial and error. At art college, he formed Rick's Blues with a young Irish kid named Gilbert O'Sullivan on drums. But dreams don't pay medical bills. When Rick's father got sick, the family needed money fast. Music was a hobby, not a career. Rick made the hardest decision of his young life. He quit the band, left school, and took a job at the local factory. Square D manufactured electrical equipment. Rick learned to weld, to work with his hands, to endure 8 hours of noise and heat and repetition. His musical hands now held blowtorches. His dreams seemed as distant as his father's ships. Every night, Rick came home covered in metal dust, too tired to think about music. The factory was stealing his soul one shift at a time, but music wouldn't let him go completely. It whispered to him in quiet moments, reminding him of what he really wanted to be. Then he heard about the Lonely Ones, a band that needed a keyboard player. Rick auditioned with a secret. He barely knew how to play organ, but he lied about his abilities and somehow got the job. It was his first lesson in the music business, fake it until you make it. The Lonely Ones became the joint and started playing in Germany, recording soundtracks for cheap films. It wasn't glamorous, but it was professional music. Rick was finally getting paid to play instead of weld, even if the pay was terrible. The band barely survived financially. Rick remembered living on soup and bread, sleeping in cheap hotels, wondering if they'd have enough money for gas to get to the next gig. The dream was alive, but it was hungry and uncertain. Eventually, the joint fell apart. Musicians drifted away to real jobs and steady paychecks. Rick found himself stranded in Germany, watching his second band die, wondering if he should just go back to the factory and forget about music. That's when Rick met Stanley Misegeus, a Dutch millionaire who collected struggling musicians like some people collect art. Misegeus had been backing the joint, but he saw something special in Rick Davis that the others missed. "Go back to England," Misegeus told Rick. "Form a new band. I'll give you the money to do it right." It was the break Rick had been waiting for, the chance to escape the factory forever. So Rick Davis returned home with nothing but his ambition and a rich man's promise. He'd learned something important during those struggling years. Talent without persistence is just noise, but persistence without talent is just stubbornness. Rick had both. The factory had taught him about building things that last. The failed bands had taught him about what didn't work. Now he was ready to build something that would work. He placed an ad in Melody Maker magazine, looking for musicians who wanted more than just another band. He was looking for partners, people who understood that making music was serious business. One person who answered that ad would change everything. Roger Hodgson came from a different world. Private schools, comfortable family, the kind of upbringing where music was encouraged, not seen as a waste of time. When he answered Rick's ad, he probably had no idea he was about to meet his musical soulmate and future enemy. They were opposites in almost every way. Rick was rough, Roger was polished. Rick's voice was gravel, Roger's was silk. Rick played blues, Roger played pop. But when they started playing together, something magical happened. Rick had the experience and the hunger. Roger had the melodies and the commercial instincts. Together, they could write songs that neither could create alone. Rick's cynicism balanced Roger's optimism. Roger's beauty softened Rick's edge. Their first band was called Daddy, which was about as uncommercial as you could get. The name didn't last long, neither did most of their early bandmates. Musicians came and went, but Rick and Roger remained, the constant center around which everything else revolved. They renamed themselves Supertramp, after an old book about a wandering hobo. It was perfect. They were musical wanderers themselves, looking for a sound that didn't quite exist yet. Stanley Misegeus kept his promise about financial backing. Supertramp became one of the first British acts signed to A&M Records' new UK division. Suddenly, Rick Davis, the factory welder, was a professional recording artist. Their debut album was simply called Supertramp. Roger sang most of the leads because his voice was prettier, more commercial, but Rick was there in the arrangements, the keyboard textures, the musical foundation that held everything together. The album flopped. Critics didn't know what to make of their sound. Fans didn't know they existed. Radio ignored them. It was a humbling introduction to the music business, but Rick had been humbled before. He knew how to endure failure. Their second album, Indelibly Stamped, gave Rick more opportunities to sing. His voice was different from Roger's, earthier, more working class, but it had character, personality. You believed Rick when he sang because he'd lived what he was singing about. For years, they played to tiny audiences in small venues. Critics either ignored them or dismissed them as pretentious. But Rick and Roger kept writing, kept believing they were onto something special. The revolving door of musicians continued. Drummers quit, bassists moved on. Only Rick and Roger remained constant, learning to trust each other's instincts, developing a creative shorthand that would serve them well. Rick's songwriting was maturing. Songs like Surely showed his growing ability to combine complex emotions with memorable melodies. He wasn't just the piano player anymore. He was becoming a real songwriter. Finally, they found the right combination. Dougie Thompson on bass, Bob Siebenberg on drums, John Helliwell on saxophone. 5 musicians who understood each other, who could work together without ego battles destroying everything. They were ready to make their breakthrough album. All those years of struggle, of lineup changes, of commercial failure had taught them valuable lessons. They knew who they were now, musically and personally. The album would be called Crime of the Century, and it would feature some of Rick's best work. Bloody Well Right was pure Rick Davis, cynical, clever, with a piano riff that grabbed you by the throat and didn't let go. Rick's vocal on Bloody Well Right was conversational, like he was explaining the world to a friend. But underneath the casual delivery was real anger, real frustration with how things worked. It was the sound of a working-class kid who'd seen behind the curtain, But the song also showed how well the partnership worked. Roger added backing vocals and arrangement ideas that made Rick's vision bigger, more accessible. They were learning to make each other better. When Crime of the Century was finished, everyone could feel they'd created something special. Not just another album, but a statement. Rick Davis, the kid who'd been told he was good for nothing except music, had helped create a masterpiece. The album was about to change everything for Supertramp. All those years of struggle, the factory job, the failed bands, the empty venues, had been leading to this moment. Rick Davis was about to hear his music on the radio. Real radio during drive time, played for people who weren't musicians or critics, but just wanted to hear something that moved them. The breakthrough was here, and Rick Davis was ready for it. The first time Rick Davis heard Bloody Well Right on commercial radio, he was driving through London traffic. He'd written the song, recorded it, lived with it for months, but hearing it come through car speakers, surrounded by regular people going about their lives, made it real in a way studio playbacks never could. Crime of the Century didn't explode overnight, but it built steadily. Bloody Well Right climbed the charts, and people started paying attention to this band called Supertramp. Rick's piano riff became something people hummed at work, sang in the shower. Suddenly, the venues got bigger. Instead of playing to dozens of people, they were playing to hundreds, then thousands. And the audiences weren't just being polite, they were singing along to Rick's songs, especially Bloody Well Right. Rick's stage presence was growing too. Behind his keyboards, he wasn't just an accompanist anymore. He was a focal point, a personality. His Wurlitzer electric piano had a sound unlike anything else. In rock music, warm, cutting, unmistakably his. When Crime of the Century went gold, Rick held the framed record and thought about the factory. All those hours welding metal, breathing fumes, watching the clock. This golden disc was proof that those days were over forever. Success brought opportunities, better studios, more time, creative freedom. Rick contributed songs like Ain't Nobody But Me and a soapbox opera to their next album, showing his range as both writer and performer. America was embracing Supertramp in a way Britain never quite did. Rick's keyboard solos got standing ovations. His songs were becoming anthems for people who felt like outsiders, people who understood his working-class perspective. Rick wrote From Now On as a quieter, more personal song. It showed he could write ballads as well as rockers, that his talent went beyond cynical observations and driving piano riffs. The song revealed the thoughtful man behind the performer. Then came a decision that would haunt Rick for decades. He and Roger agreed to share songwriting royalties with the rest of the band, even though Dougie, John, and Bob weren't writing songs. At the time, it seemed generous, fair. They were a team after all. Success meant money, and money meant choices Rick had never had before. Nice house, good cars, the freedom to focus entirely on music. But more importantly, it meant respect. Rick Davis was no longer just some factory worker with dreams. He was a professional musician at the highest level. Their next album would be called Breakfast in America, and it would make them superstars. Rick co-wrote the title track with Roger, bringing his cynical perspective to Roger's melodic vision. The result was their most perfect collaboration. But Rick's showcase was Goodbye Stranger, a song that displayed every aspect of his talent. He sang everything from booming bass notes to piercing falsetto, sometimes within the same line. The song proved he could carry a hit single just as effectively as Roger. When Breakfast in America was released, it became an instant phenomenon. #1 in America, massive sales worldwide. Rick Davis had gone from factory worker to international rock star in less than a decade. The album produced hit after hit. Roger's The Logical Song and Take the Long Way Home. Rick's Goodbye Stranger. For the first time, both songwriters in Supertramp were getting equal recognition from radio and fans. A Grammy nomination for Album of the Year put them in competition with the biggest names in music. Rick Davis, who'd once thought he was only good at music according to his mother, was now being judged alongside superstars. The tour that followed was unlike anything they'd experienced. Arenas holding 20,000 people, all singing along to songs Rick had written in small apartments and rented houses. His keyboard solos stopped shows cold. Canada embraced Supertramp completely. Both Crime of the Century and Breakfast in America went diamond there, 10 times platinum. Rick's songs were as popular as Roger's, proving the partnership worked on every level. Suddenly, everyone wanted to know about Supertramp's secret. Rick and Roger gave interviews explaining their process, their influences, their partnership. Rick talked about growing up working class, about Gene Krupa, about learning music the hard way. Success brought artistic freedom. Rick could experiment, try new sounds, follow his musical instincts wherever they led. His songwriting was becoming more sophisticated, more personal. My Kind of Lady became their last major hit of this era, and it was almost entirely Rick's creation. The song showcased his full vocal range and proved he could craft a complete hit single without Roger's input. At their peak, Supertramp could sell out any venue in the world. Rick's songs were classics now, part of the soundtrack of people's lives. He'd achieved everything a working-class kid from Swindon could dream of, but success was changing things. Rick and Roger were writing separately now, coming together only to record and perform. The easy friendship of the early years was being replaced by professional courtesy and underlying tension. Their next album would be their last together. The partnership that had created Crime of the Century and Breakfast in America was about to fracture under the weight of its own success. The peak of their achievement was also the beginning of the end. The cracks were showing everywhere. Rick and Roger barely talked anymore except about business. They'd arrive at the studio at different times, work on separate songs, leave without discussing what they'd created. The partnership that had once felt effortless now felt like work. "We were like Lennon and McCartney," Roger would say later. "We wrote separately, but shared the credits. That was my mistake because my songs were usually the hits. It was an observation that cut deep because it was largely true. The numbers didn't lie." Roger had written The Logical Song, Breakfast in America, Take the Long Way Home, most of their biggest commercial successes. Rick's songs were important, but they weren't selling millions of records. When millions of dollars were at stake, creative partnerships became business arrangements. The generous royalty deal they'd made with the band, sharing money with non-writing members, was costing Rick and Roger serious money. But changing it meant admitting their family was falling apart. Roger wanted to renegotiate everything. He felt his commercial success entitled him to a bigger share. Rick believed in honoring commitments, even expensive ones. What had seemed fair when they were struggling felt unfair now that they were rich. The fundamental problem went deeper than money. Roger wanted a normal life, time with his family, breaks from touring, the luxury of saying no to opportunities. He'd achieved everything he'd dreamed of and was ready to step back. Rick was just hitting his creative stride. He felt like he was finally becoming the musician he'd always wanted to be. The thought of stepping back, of doing anything else, was impossible. Music wasn't just his career, it was his identity. Their musical tastes were diverging too. Rick wanted to explore progressive rock, jazz influences, complex arrangements. Roger preferred the pop sensibilities that had made Breakfast in America successful. They were growing as artists, but in different directions. My Kind of Lady showed how far apart they'd grown. The song was almost entirely Rick's creation. Roger contributed almost nothing as writer or performer. It was like watching a marriage die in real time. Even their live performances reflected the tension. Rick and Roger stood at opposite ends of the stage, rarely interacting, focused on their own performances. The chemistry that had made early Supertramp concerts magical was gone. Journalists started asking uncomfortable questions about Supertramp's future. The band tried to downplay the rumors, but anyone with eyes could see the relationship was fracturing. Roger was already planning his escape, writing and recording solo material without telling Rick. For a partnership built on collaboration, this felt like the ultimate betrayal. Every decision became a negotiation. Tour routing, album promotion, which songs to play live. Nothing was simple anymore. The band needed lawyers to have conversations that used to happen over dinner. Rick formed Rick Davis Productions and started making unilateral decisions about Supertramp's future. Some saw it as necessary leadership, others saw it as Rick pushing Roger out of his own band. Their final album sessions together were exercises in professional courtesy. Rick and Roger did their jobs, recorded their parts, and left. There was no creativity, no spontaneity, no friendship. When the album was finished, Roger made his decision. He was done. The most successful creative partnership in Supertramp's history was ending not with explosions, but with lawyers and press releases. The official announcement mentioned creative differences and different life priorities. But everyone knew the real story. two strong-willed men who'd created something beautiful together and then couldn't figure out how to share it. Rick was left with a choice: end Supertramp entirely, or continue without his creative partner. He owned the name, controlled the business, had the loyalty of the other band members, but he'd lost something irreplaceable. According to Roger, they made a verbal deal when he left. Rick would keep the Supertramp name and focus on his own songs. Roger would keep his songs and start fresh. Neither would interfere with the other's music. It was an agreement born of hurt feelings and wounded pride. And like most agreements made in anger, it was destined to be broken. Rick Davis had everything he'd ever wanted: commercial success, critical respect, financial security. But he'd lost the one thing that had made it all possible: his musical partnership with Roger Hodgson. The question now was whether Rick could reinvent Supertramp without Roger, and whether the magic they'd created together could ever be recaptured, or if some things once broken, stay broken forever. For the first time in over a decade, Rick Davis was making music completely on his own terms. No arguments about arrangements, no compromises on song selection, no partner to consider. It should have felt like freedom. Instead, it felt like amputation. Supertramp's first post-Roger album was called Brother Where You Bound. Rick had promised to honor their verbal agreement. He would focus on his own material, leave Roger's songs alone. The result was more experimental, more progressive than anything they'd done in years. Cannonball became a genuine hit, proving Rick could create commercial music without Roger's melodic sensibilities. The song was pure Rick Davis, sophisticated, slightly bitter, with a keyboard arrangement that was impossible to ignore. The tour was different: smaller venues, more intimate settings, audiences who came specifically to hear Rick's vision of Supertramp. Without Roger's biggest hits to rely on, Rick had to prove himself as a complete entertainer. "We went back to our progressive roots," Rick explained to journalists. "This is what Supertramp was before we became a pop band." He seemed liberated by the creative freedom, even if it meant smaller commercial returns. Dougie Thompson, John Hellowell, and Bob Siebenberg remained loyal to Rick. They'd been receiving their share of royalties from the old agreement, and they appreciated that Rick was keeping Supertramp alive. For them, it was both a livelihood and an identity. Their next album, Free as a Bird, pushed even further into progressive territory. Rick was exploring jazz influences, complex time signatures, longer compositions. It was the music he'd always wanted to make, freed from commercial pressures. But commercial success was harder to achieve without Roger's hit-making instincts. The albums were critically respected and financially profitable, but they weren't dominating charts or selling millions of copies. Then, during a tour in the late 80s, Rick made a decision that would define the rest of his career. He started performing The Logical Song and other Roger Hodgson compositions. The verbal agreement was broken. The crowd response was immediate and overwhelming. These were the songs that had made Supertramp famous, and audiences wanted to hear them regardless of who was singing. Rick justified it as giving fans what they wanted. Roger was furious. He felt betrayed, claiming Rick had promised never to perform his songs. For Roger, it wasn't about money. It was about artistic integrity and keeping promises. The friendship was officially over. What had been a creative disagreement became a legal battle, with lawyers exchanging threats and accusations. The music business had completely consumed the music, but Rick kept performing the entire Supertramp catalog. His reasoning was simple. Fans didn't care who wrote what. They wanted to hear The Logical Song and Take the Long Way Home, and he was the only one touring under the Supertramp name. Supertramp officially disbanded, but Rick couldn't stay away from music. In the 90s, he reformed the band and started recording again. 2 more studio albums followed, proving there was still life in the Supertramp brand. A reunion tour in the new millennium was successful but incomplete. Rick was performing with original members, but the obvious absence of Roger Hodgson made every show feel like half a band. Then Rick's health began to fail. Multiple myeloma, a blood cancer, forced him to cancel tours and spend months in treatment. The man who'd survived factory work and music business battles was facing his toughest fight yet. Even while battling cancer, the legal fights with Roger continued. Royalty disputes, song ownership conflicts, arguments that had been going on for decades. The music business doesn't stop for illness. Roger reportedly offered to return to Supertramp for a final tour, but Rick refused. Too much hurt, too much pride, too many years of fighting. Some wounds don't heal just because time passes. In his final years, Rick sometimes performed under the name Ricky and the Rockets, playing small venues with local musicians. It was a return to his roots, but also an admission that the Supertramp name carried too much baggage. In his last interview, Rick expressed satisfaction with his musical legacy, but regret about the personal cost. He'd achieved everything he'd dreamed of as a working-class kid, but he'd lost his most important creative partnership in the process. Rick Davis had reinvented Supertramp without Roger Hodgson, but he could never recreate the magic they'd made together. He'd proven he could carry the name alone, but the music was inevitably different, arguably lesser. The surprise wasn't that Rick continued without Roger. The surprise was how long the bitterness lasted, how completely the partnership was destroyed by success. The cancer came quietly, the way cancer usually does. Rick Davis had survived factory work, music business battles, and decades of legal warfare. But multiple myeloma was a different kind of enemy, one that couldn't be outlasted or outfought. The diagnosis forced Rick to cancel a major European tour. For a man who'd spent his life performing, who'd defined himself through music, the silence was devastating. Suddenly, Rick Davis wasn't a rock star anymore. He was just another sick old man. But Rick approached cancer the way he'd approached everything else, with stubborn determination. He underwent aggressive treatment, lost weight, lost hair, but never lost the belief that he'd beat this thing and get back to music.